Hello, Mark Sabatella here with the Mastering MuseScore School. In this video, I'm going to show you a reharmonization technique and show you how to use it with the song Silent Night. Now, I did a reharmonization of this song several years ago that I posted to musescore.com. It's been really popular, a lot of downloads of it, and it used a lot of different techniques, really. But most of what I did in that reharmonization is based on one simple idea, the idea of what are called secondary dominants. So that's what I'm going to primarily be talking about in this video, our secondary dominants, and just how much color that you can bring to your music with that one technique and a few little tweaks here and there. So I'm going to start here by just playing Silent Night, or having MuseScore play Silent Night for you using the basic chords that we normally hear with this song. There's nothing but a 1 chord, C, a 4 chord, F, and a 5 chord, G7. So let's hear that. Okay, so that's what the usual chords sound like. That's how you're accustomed to hearing this. I'm going to be adding a lot of new chords here, and most of them are going to come about as a result of using this concept of secondary dominance. So let me briefly define what I mean by that. So a dominant chord means the 5 chord, right? So in the key of C, G7 is the dominant. So G7, the dominant, likes to resolve to the tonic. So G7 likes to resolve to C. Right? That's 5 to 1. It's a beautiful sound. The idea of a secondary dominant is to say, you know what? That sound of 5 resolving to 1 is so powerful, so beautiful. Let's make use of it other places other than just to get to the actual 1 chord. So what do I mean by that? Well, for instance, here we have the 4 chord on Round Yon Virgin. That's the 4 chord, F. Well, what if we wanted to give that F chord its own dominant? So we're not in the key of F, but what if we pretend we're in the key of F? If we pretend we're in the key of F, the 5 chord in that key would be C. Well, it happens that there already is a C chord before that, but the C chord that we're hearing in All Is Bright, it sounds like the 1 chord still. It doesn't sound unique. It doesn't really push us to that F chord. To make that happen, we're going to make it not just a triad, but a dominant 7th. Just like my 5 chord, G7, I had a dominant 7th. I'm going to do the same here. So I'm going to make Bright be a C7 chord. So here's now All Is Bright. So notice how that B flat that got added to the C7 chord, that introduces a note not in the key, a non-diatonic note. And it really sort of helps the ear understand that, hey, a change is coming. And then when we land on the F, it's very satisfying. C7 to F sounds like 5 to 1. So let's hear that one more time. So that's the idea of a secondary dominant. In order to apply that really effectively, we need to learn a couple other techniques. And so I want to talk about a couple other things that we can do. One of the things that you hear me say often, if you've taken like my Harmony and Chord Progressions course, or if you're in my music masterclass, which I highly recommend, you might have heard me say anything 5 can do, 2-5 can do better. So for instance, I have a 5 chord here, All Is Calm, G7, and it just sits there for 2 measures. Well, why not create some more interest? Instead of just having a 5 chord, G7, let's go with one measure of D minor 7 and then a measure of G7. So I have a 2 and a 5. They pair together nicely. And it's actually for a similar reason to why secondary dominants work. It's all about the circle of fifths. 5 to 1, like C to F, that's down a fifth. Well, 2 to 5, D minor 7 to G7, is also down a fifth. That down to fifth motion is super powerful in Western music. So let's hear that little passage starting at All Is Calm Now, where we'll hear D minor 7 to G7. You see how much color we've managed to add just by using that secondary dominant C7, and then this principle that says anything 5 can do, 2/5 can do better. So those two principles are really, really powerful. We can get a lot of mileage out of them. Let me show you how we can combine them now. So let's look at this D minor that we've now added. One of the things that giving that D minor 7, that putting that D minor 7 there, one of the things it did for us is it made that phrase, all is calm, a little more interesting because it has two chords instead of just one, right? Instead of just G7 for two measures, we get a D minor 7 and a G7. But the other thing it did is it gave us a D minor 7 at the start of the phrase. It gave us a 2 chord rather than a 5 chord at the start of the phrase. I can't really give you a good reason for what I'm about to tell you, except that my experience shows me that it's true over and over again. Phrases that start with the 5 chord are harder to work with, harder to create interest around. Changing that phrase to start with the 2 chord allows me to do some really interesting things leading to that chord. So it's very often the case that not only does replacing the 5 with the 2/5 improve that phrase, but it also can improve the previous phrase by letting you lead to this phrase in more interesting ways. So what do I mean by that? I now have a D minor 7 at the beginning of this phrase. Well, let's give it a secondary dominant. So the 5 chord in the key of D minor would be A, or A7. So I'm always going to use dominant 7th chords here. So A7 is the 5 chord in the key of D minor. So having A7 lead to D minor gives us again that illusion of a 5 to 1 in D minor. So I put that on the word night of Holy Night. Let's hear Holy Night and then All Is Calm. Right? So that A7 on night leads really nicely into the D minor on all. The A7 to the D minor. It's like 5 to 1. But now we can also use that technique that says anything 5 can do, 2/5 can do better. So instead of just having an A7, the 5 chord in the key of D minor, let's put a 2 there also. In other words, the 2 chord in the key of D minor. In the key of D minor, the 2 chord would be E half diminished. So I could actually try to cram both chords into that same measure there on night, but I think I'm not going to do that. I don't want my chords to move too fast. It can be kind of jarring if chords move too fast. So we do that when we want to, but here I don't want. I want to average about 1 chord per measure here. So what instead, I'm just going to go to the previous measure. In the previous measure, I have an invisible C chord there because I wanted to hear MuseScore play the C again, even though the chord hasn't changed. I'm going to delete that and add this E half diminished chord. I'll notate it as minor 7, flat 5. And so now let's hear that Holy Night. So that works really well. It creates 2, 5, 1 in the key of D minor. When we do that, A7 is what's called a secondary dominant. I call this whole progression here, the E half diminished to A7 to D minor, I call that a secondary 2/5 because it's like a 2/5 in the key of D minor where we're going. Now, even though the 2 chord in a minor key is supposed to be half diminished, or minor 7 flat 5, same thing, realistically, we often don't use the flat 5. We often just use a plain minor 7 chord. So instead of E minor 7 flat 5, I'm going to just change that to E minor 7. Either of them can work. One of the reasons why the E minor 7 sort of might work a little better is, well, that B flat, well, first of all, B flat is there. The reason it's half diminished is because the key of D minor has a B flat in it. But we know the key of D minor also uses B naturals, right? I mean, melodic minor is a thing. Melodic minor has a B natural. So does Dorian, if you're familiar with that. And the key of the piece is C. So that has a B natural also. So the B natural is going to feel good. It's going to feel connected to the original key, and yet it's also going to still resolve very nicely to the A7. I don't need the flat 5 for that. So this is going to be a little brighter sound. Without the B flat, that half diminished, instead having a minor 7 is just a little brighter. So let's hear that. To me, that's maybe a little more what I want to hear. In fact, all is bright is about what the lyric is going to say. I'm not looking for darkness right here. So at this point, I have a chord in every single measure of this first line, instead of just every 2 measures like I started with, except the second measure is kind of all by itself. So let's fix that. Let's hear it from the beginning. Now, there's nothing wrong with a measure that has no new chord. Nothing wrong at all. A guitar player would actually, continue strumming the C chord. And in fact, if I put another C chord in here so we can hear a MuseScore play it a second time, it doesn't sound bad. But no, now that I've gotten this expectation going in the rest of the piece that there's going to be a new chord every measure, I don't want it like that here. So I'm going to get rid of that C chord and replace it with something. So I'm talking about secondary dominance. Is that going to work here? In other words, how about taking this E minor and giving it its own 5 chord? Well, the 5 chord in the key of E minor is B7. So I could try to put a B7 in the measure before. However, I can tell you right now, this is not going to sound good. And it's not going to sound good for 2 reasons. One is our melody note of E is going to clash with that B7. B7 has a D sharp in it. E is a half step away from that D sharp. It's like this is the 4th of the B7 chord. So the B7 and the E is not going to sound good with the E. But also B7 it's got 2 notes not in the key of C, right? We're in the key of C. B7 has a D sharp and an F sharp. That's a lot of color for the second measure of the song. I might want to save that kind of color for a little bit later if I use it at all. So I'm going to play it so you can hear it, and then we'll get rid of it. Yeah, it's a little too jarring. It's out of character with everything else. Everything else that's in here, I mean, I approach this as a jazz musician, and these are all things that jazz musicians would do without a second thought, but nothing that's happening here is anything that Mozart wouldn't have done or Bach wouldn't have done also. Secondary dominance, 2 5s, all of this has been part of the language of music for centuries. This sound that we just had there, though, in that second measure, it's just not in keeping with that sound. So I'm going to get rid of the B7. So B7 would have led to E minor. It just didn't work there. Well, in point of fact, there's no other chord that really leads to E minor really well. Secondary dominants are the chord that does it the best, so I'm not going to think in terms of leading to E minor. I'm going to think about just not leading anywhere. Chords that are just happy to just sit there and move on. Inert is the term I sometimes use. It's an inert chord that I'm looking for, a chord that I can put in the second measure that won't mess up anything else. And the chords that do that, for me, If you're looking for a chord that you could just go to, someplace other than one, that you can go to just for a change of pace without messing anything up, if you've studied classical theory, you might recognize that's essentially the description that's usually given of the four chord or subdominant function in general. If I put an F chord here, the F chord is just sort of stable. It doesn't lead anywhere in particular. So why not follow it with an E minor 7? You could follow it with anything. Four chords can be followed by just about anything and be happy. The melody note here, E, is the major seventh of that F chord. So I will say here you have to accept a certain amount of jazz language to be happy with that major seventh. But I don't think, even if you're not normally accustomed to listening to jazz, I don't think you're going to hear that as being particularly unusual sounding. Let's hear it. So there you have it. The first 8 measures reharmonize just using secondary dominants and diatonic chords. In other words, that idea of taking that 5, G7, and expanding it into a 2-5, or inserting this diatonic 4 chord. This idea of secondary dominance and really getting a little more mileage out of our diatonic chord so it's not just 1, 4, and 5. This is what I'm going to do for the rest of the piece. And I've already explained the concepts, so it's not going to take me long to go through the rest of the piece. And I promise it's going to be worth it. So we have our F chord on round yawn virgin, and then it's going to come to C. Well, assuming that I keep that C there, I got to put a 5 chord before it, right? Well, I don't have to, but that's what I'm going to think about. So if I want to put a G7 chord here, this is going to have the same issue that I mentioned when I had B7 in the second measure. The melody note here, C, kind of clashes with the third of the G7 chord. G7 has a B in it. This melody of C is going to kind of clash with it. So I might not be too happy with this sound. Let's listen to it. So, not great. It's okay. Not great. I think there's a couple things that I could do about it. One is I could expand it into a 2-5, right? Anything 5 can do, 2-5 can do better. It's going to require putting 2 chords in that measure. I'm going to do that. I'm going to put D minor 7 for the first beat, and then I guess I'll put the G7 on the third beat. And I will say I'm much happier with 2 chords in a measure in 4/4 time than I am in 3/4 time. Because in 3/4, now you have to decide which chord gets 2 beats and which chord only gets 1. Or if you're going to try to put that second chord on the end of 2, which is maybe a jazzier type of thing. It's a jazz waltz feel. So I went with 2 beats of the D minor 7 and then made the G7 line up with beat 3 because that's where the melody note is. So let's hear that. So yeah, I could do that. I feel like that's probably too much, at least at this tempo. If I were to do it slower, maybe I'd be happier with it. But I think I'm not going to do that. I think instead I'm going to use another trick, which is I'm still going to go with that G7, but I'm going to call it a G7 sus. It's, I won't say cheating, but it basically says, hey, let's not use the B on that G7 chord. Let's just replace the B with a C, and now it won't clash with the melody. Well, that's actually a fairly useful trick. I could have tried it in that second measure with the B7, but I already kind of knew it was a little too far afield from what I was looking for there, so I didn't bother trying it. You can if you want. But let's hear this. I think it's going to work pretty well here. Right? I mean, I think that works pretty well, the G7 sus. So the chord has a C in it instead of a B, and that doesn't clash with the C in the melody. The B that shows up in the melody, that's on the and of 2. It's only an 8th note, and now I'm not worried about that. You could actually then resolve that, if you're playing that G7 chord, you could then resolve it to a plain G7 on beat 3. You wouldn't want to repeat the whole chord, but you might move the C to a B in your voicing. MuseScore's not going to do that though, right? MuseScore's going to play the whole chord again, and that's not going to sound so great. But I'll put it in there just so you can hear it. So maybe you can get the idea that if it hadn't played the whole chord over again, but just moved the C to a B, that probably would have sounded pretty good. But I'm actually fine with just G7 sus for the whole measure. All right, so coming up to our next empty measure, we have a measure empty. It's not empty, it just has no new chord. And again, I want to look at where I'm going. I'm trying to get to this F chord. Well, we've already seen that to get to an F chord, use a secondary dominant, C7. So I put my, C7 on mother and child. So here's Round Yon Virgin. All right, so at this point, I've done half this first line, and I could do the exact same thing to start the second half, the Holy Infant. I could have F chord and then again a G7 sus and come back to C. But as long as I'm going to the trouble of making these chords more interesting, I kind of want to avoid doing exactly the same thing again. I'm not saying I'm not going to ever use the same chord again, but I might want a different thing overall to happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to not think about what's happening on Holy Infant, Tender and Mild, so Tender and Mild, until I look a little bit ahead at where I'm going to. I'm going to Sleep in Heavenly Peace. And so I want to make the same observation I made before. Anything 5 could do, 2/5 can do better. Let's replace that G7 with D minor 7 to G7. By doing that, again, I make Sleep in Heavenly Peace a little more interesting. Right? But also, I give myself a D minor at the beginning of the phrase that I can then target with a secondary dominant or a secondary 2/5. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to put an A7 to get to that D minor. So the D minor on Sleep, I'm going to put an A7 on Mild right before that. So let's hear Tender and Mild. So that makes me, happy. I like the A7 going to the D minor, but I'm not feeling like I'm done here. What I am going to do is I am going to put in that G7 sus in the same place that I had it before, so the second measure. So already this second phrase of the second line is a little different than the first phrase. The first phrase was F, G, C, C7. The next one's F, G, C, A7. But that's not good enough for me. Not only is it almost the exact same phrase twice in a row, but also I don't like coming back to the one chord so often. To me, that robs a song of the sense of, adventure and motion to keep coming back to one so often. So one of the things that I often aim for in reharmonization is avoiding the one chord, not completely, but not using it so much. So in this case, I am going to use the same technique that I used in the first line of saying, hey, instead of giving that D minor just a secondary dominant, A7, let's give it a secondary 2/5. An E minor also. So I'm going to actually rip out that C chord and just replace it with E minor 7. And notice in both the times when I did that, the original chord that was in that measure was C, and I replaced it with E minor 7. Now realistically, it wouldn't have mattered what the original chord was. If that E minor 7 fit the melody, I would have been happy to use it and just throw out the original chord. But I'm especially happy here because E minor 7 and C have a lot in common. C is C, E, G. E minor is E, G, B, right? So they share those two notes in common, E and G. And if you make them as seventh chords, C, E, G, B, major seventh, E minor 7 is E, G, B, D. They have three notes in common in that case. So 1 and 3 have a lot in common, and they substitute for each other pretty freely. So if you're trying to avoid the 1, 3 can be an effective substitute. And I'm still happy to have that G7 leading there. G7 felt like it was going to go to C, and then we go to E minor instead. We go to 3 instead. It's a deceptive resolution. Remember that term. I'm coming back to it. So let's hear now that whole second. Actually, let's just hear tender and mild. Yeah? All right, so now let's hear that whole second line. All right, I played it all the way to the end so we could hear how much there is left to do, and it's actually very little. The only place where I don't have a new chord is on the uh, the second note of peace. Right? I have sleep, heavenly peace. Okay, I sing sometimes. So sleep in heavenly peace. When the peace goes up, there's no new chord. Here, I have to say I'm relying not just on my notion of how I can replace chords, but the things that I've heard before to give me some ideas of what to do. So the first thing I'm going to try is just putting another diatonic chord in here. Because notice the chord that I'm trying to get to is another C chord. Right? So I could say peace is on a C, and then the second note of peace, the E, I could put a G7 there and then come back to C for sleep. Let's hear that. I don't think I'm going to like it. So it's not bad, but to me that's a little too G7-y now, right? Every other measure is now G7. D minor, G7. C, G7. C with a G in the bass, G7. It's too much. It's now too much G7. It's too much 5. So I'm not going to do that. So one of the things I could do is think about diatonic chords that could have an E in it. I haven't used an A minor yet, and A minor has an E in it. I kind of want to try that. I used an E minor here, and I could use an E minor, but my gut is telling me A minor might sound better. I'm going to try it. I like that. That is actually pretty good. As long as we're at it, I should try some of the other choices. Let's use E minor. I don't like that one as much. Because I mentioned that my other kind of inert chord was F. Oops, not F minor. I do love that chord, but that's for another lesson. Let's hear that. Again, it's going to mean the melody note is the major 7th. Let's hear it. I don't think I've ever tried this before. Huh. That's not bad. That's not bad. But what I really want to show you is what I think I've used in this before, and certainly what I've heard in it before. And that is, remember I mentioned deceptive resolution and said you're going to hear that again? Well, here I have this 2, 5 on sleep in heavenly. It's D minor 7 to G7. What if instead of going back to 1, I go with a deceptive resolution? So we already had G7 resolving to E minor, the 3 chord, but that 3 chord, E minor, doesn't really fit this melody here of C. A minor does. And that's the 6th chord. And actually, if you study classical theory, that's the deceptive resolution they usually teach you first, is having 5 go to 6. in my world of jazz and sort of American popular music of the 20th century, um, it's actually probably more common for that 5 to go to 3 as a way of kind of avoiding 1. But in this case, the 6 is, I think, going to sound beautiful. And I know it's going to sound beautiful because I think you've probably heard it this way before. It's a pretty common substitution. Kind of nice, right? While we're at it, I got to get rid of this. I don't have to get rid of this F, but now I have to ask myself what chord might fit over that E. Other because that F chord is fine. I'm fine with the F, but I want to show you one more thing. The other thing that I want to show you here is this pair of chords on Sleep in Heavenly Peace here, the C with a G in the bass, and then G7. That sequence in Roman numeral analysis, we call this 1-6-4. C is our 1 chord. It's in second inversion. G is in the bass. So 6-4. This is 1-6-4 followed by 5-7. Most theoreticians will say, you know, that 1-6-4 isn't really a 1 chord. They look at that whole thing and they take a step back and say, you know what, that whole thing is really like one big 5 chord. It's like a 5 chord with some stuff going on. Because really, that G is in the bass for both of them, right? Our ear processes that as a G chord with just some funny notes in the melody. That's as good an explanation as you'll ever get of that phenomenon. The fact that 1-6-4 to 5-7, we can really just see the whole thing as 5-7 with some funny melody notes. Well, now that I've got basically this whole G7 for 2 measures, and in this case, I don't want to put a 2 chord in there because A, D minor 7 does not fit that melody of C, G, E, and I've already got something interesting that I haven't used before. I've got a 1-6-4 chord. So I've already got an interesting variation on G7. But now that I'm seeing this whole thing as basically a G7, it kind of makes me want to say, well, what if I put a secondary dominant on that G7? I haven't really tried that yet because I keep replacing my 5 chords with 2 5s. What is the secondary dominant for G7? Well, it's D, or D7. So D7 will lead to G nicely, and it will continue to do so even though we have this C over G in the way, I promise, because you're going to hear it in a second. I'm going to put a D7 in that second measure of peace. This is a really interesting sound that I think you're going to like. I know I like it a lot. The E here is the 9th of that D7, which is it's an interesting color tone. But it also gives us this really nice circle of fifths motion coming from the A minor to the D7, right? That's circle of fifths. It creates this illusion of a 2-5. So I'm going to play that, and then I'm going to make one final adjustment. Yeah, I like that a lot. I said I'm going to make one final adjustment. I'm gonna try it, but I think I might actually come back to this. The only thing that I'm thinking about is, maybe if I put that D7 with an F sharp in the bass, that F sharp will lead nicely to the G. I feel like that bass line from A down to F sharp coming up to G. A, F sharp, G. I feel like I'm going to like that because I know that I've played a version of it that did that. Let's hear it. All right, I'm on the fence as to whether I liked it in the inversion or in root position better. But I'll tell you what, I'm going to leave it that way for now. Just because we haven't used inversions anywhere, and inversions are a thing, right? And they get used for specific reasons, and this is exactly the kind of reason we would use inversions. So I feel it's important to represent that. So we have now put a chord in every measure of the song, and we've kind of gotten rid of some of the C's that were there, so it's not as C heavy, it's not as 1 heavy as it was. So I'm going to play you the whole song now, and I think hopefully you will agree that just by using secondary dominants and then a couple of basic diatonic substitutions, knowing 2/5 can substitute for 5, knowing about deceptive resolutions, uh, and that the idea that 3 and 1 can kind of substitute for each other. Uh, that's all I've done here. The real bulk of the work is done by the secondary dominants. That's what really creates all the interest in this. And let's hear the whole thing now. Yeah, that makes me happy. It makes me happy because it's a beautiful song to begin with. The simple 1, 4, and 5 chords were quite effective. The harmonizations that I posted to musescore.com, I went a lot further using more jazz techniques, tritone substitutions, and other whatnot. But there's a lot of value to be had just using secondary dominants. This is the language that really has defined so much of Western music, so much pop music, so much classical music, and so much of jazz really is based on diatonic chords plus secondary dominants. And so hearing how you can kind of transform a song like Silent Night using really just that technique and a couple of small little adjustments within the realm of the diatonic chords, you can get a really beautiful sound like that. So I hope you've enjoyed this demonstration, and would love to see what some of you all come up with if you want to try this technique on some other songs. So thanks a lot for listening.